Now, this might be the hottest night so far of the year, is it? 115? Yes, we could all tell. So,
This is a rack hot, so just FYI.
however, having read the opening scene this afternoon to refresh my memory of Red Metal, when they are trapped inside vehicles in Afghanistan, I decided that no matter how hot it was here, it wasn't as brutal as being inside.
That's close.
It was not. So this is a book, as you can plainly tell, just looking at it, with a very broad scope, right? I mean, it's a big book, so they're covering a lot of territory. I'm assuming that your friend, the Lieutenant Colonel over here, was there to, why? Give you authenticity, which you probably didn't really need, or just expand the battlefield?
No, it's funny. Rip's trying to be really, really self-effacing, and I keep yelling at him. I'm like, I'm saying the exact opposite of what you're saying, because I'm telling the truth. There's no reason to be self-effacing. I met Rip at the Pentagon when I was doing research on a Tom Clancy novel, and Rip was a writer. He helped me with that book, and was just an interesting guy. We just became good buddies, and I'd go up and see him in Virginia, and he got stationed out at Camp Pendleton in California, and I'd go out and visit him, and we weren't talking about working together or anything. His story is that he asked me if I'd write a book with him, and I shot him down. And, like
He did.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I do that a lot.
I sent his agent a message. I said, I have a great idea for a book. Do you think Mark would be interested? So he's got kind of a fan email, so you're welcome to write to him. So I wrote him an email. I said, hey, what do you think about this book? And he's like, no.
Yeah. And here we are. So it took me some convincing.
He wore you down.
He wore me down. Now, we just became really good friends, and we would talk about ideas for things he was going to write or something I was thinking about working on. And it just went back and forth until finally I was like, I could probably go get us a book deal. And immediately, just a couple days later, I was in Las Vegas at his Marine Corps ball. He was battalion commander, and they were having a Marine Corps ball, and he invited me out. And he said, hey, you want to have some coffee? And I went up to his room with coffee, and he had laid out maps. He had like a big sword, like his ceremonial sword, like holding the maps down. I was like, okay. And he talked about this sort of whole battle plan, not the book itself, but basically what would happen in the story. And I was kind of hooked. We wrote a 91 chapter outline and presented that to get the book deal. So that was 2016, and we started researching in 17 and finished it this year.
So there's your origin story right there. So I could tell you were a battlefield commander, because those are pretty good tactics.
I said, well, I think, for me and Mark, the research part was one of the most fun parts. We had a chance to fly around. I think we visited Germany. Mark visited Poland. I went to France. We went to Nellis Air Force Base together. So even though I think we had some really good background, we had a good idea of what we wanted to do, getting out there and visiting some places was awesome.
So which one of you visited the mine in Kenya?
Well, he had been stationed in Africa. It was funny. I was looking at going to Kenya, and I was like, oh, they've got that Zika thing, and no thanks. But Rip's like, yeah, I was stationed in Djibouti, and so he was kind of near there and all that. So I got off the hook.
The mine in Kenya is an integral part of the plot, so that's why I thought I would bring it up. So before we go on, are you still an actively serving Marine?
I am for 2 more weeks.
2 more weeks?
2 more weeks, yeah.
You mean
20.
all of this has gone to your head and you quit your day job?
Well, not really.
It depends on how many books he sells tonight.
Yeah, that's right. No,
No pressure.
23 years. Absolutely. 23 years, well, 22 and a half years, whatever it is, and 10 deployments, and 1 back surgery is the way I like to put it. So I'm an infantry and reconnaissance officer, and I think after 23 years, I've done everything I wanted to do maybe 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And so I'd like to spend some time with the family.
And right.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Right.
Oh, so this is really the dawn of our career.
Nice to say it.
So we could start out by saying thank you for your service, right? That would be a really nice thing to do.
I was buffered up by thousands of Marines, so I just did my part. But
Well,
a lot of other guys
I
did
could
their
tell
part.
that you've actually done this by reading the first chapter of the book, because I don't think that you could have written a scene like that if you hadn't lived through it.
You know what's fun is that obviously Mark has written for many, many years, so Mark is the penultimate master when it comes to this. And I think as we started to kind of dissect who was going to write what, we basically divided up by character and said, well, you've got a penchant for this person and you have a penchant for that one. And so the story arcs kind of came together naturally. We knew that the entire plot, as Mark said, we had 91 chapters. But I think as we started to research together, Mark knowing how to write, me being, perhaps just the warrior guy who's able to say, well, here's something that would lend some authenticity to it. Mark was able to kind of shepherd me along and say, well, here's some things that's going to make the story that much better. So I think it was a true blend in that sense, is that there wasn't Rip wrote one chapter and Mark wrote the other. In fact, there were some really neat spots where Mark said, hey, look, I want you to take over my character for these 2 chapters because he or she's going to do something I think you'll be able to write. And for me, that was a great experience because on some of his characters, and I think likewise for some of mine, we had some really neat story arcs, and so that was kind of cool to take over this other person and go, okay, how am I going to make sure I don't mess it up, and also sound as though I keep that storyline that Mark has started.
Well, there are a lot of characters and a lot going on, so you actually can have more than one voice in this book. You should have more than one voice in this book, right?
That's right. And in fact, I remember from the very beginning, and I told Rick this 1,000 times, that the difficult part for us is going to be reining this in and having a good narrative arc, because you're not just following one guy. It would have been really disingenuous, and I've sort of read books like this where like one person happens to be where everything goes down, so to give you that POV. And so I kind of had to like loosen up my own like tight brain of how to craft a thriller and be like, okay, this is Red Storm Rising, or like one of these big sort of epic-y stories, and go a little bit wider with it. There's a large section of the book where there's several characters that you never see again, but they're all integral to what's happening the night of the invasion, and so they're all super important, and they all push the plot forward. And so I left them in, but I remember thinking like, okay, we're not going to see this guy again. Who cares what color his hat is or whatever? But you just put enough characterization in there for that, and hopefully, the original draft we turned in was 250,000 words or so.
It was 2 books, actually.
Yeah, easily 2 books, and it was. I was here before, and you were like, "Why don't you cut it in half and do 2 books?" And I was like, "Well, if I'm smart enough to create a halfway point, I would have, but it didn't come together like that." But what we finally published, I think, is 217.
It's a big book.
Yeah.
But it is a big stage, and let's be real, since you start off in Afghanistan, and then we shift to Taiwan, and then we're in Africa now. If you'd had one person, you would have had to been like Batman or something.
It would have been pretty fun.
To try to, and
You
that's
should have thought about it.
yeah. You could have had there's still potential for a superhero that you could do that. But I thought part of the point of the book was, in fact, to paint a global stage and to point out that the threats are coming from so many places at the moment, because you have, this is all in the beginning, so I'm not spoiling this for you. You've got like Chinese people infiltrating Taiwan over here, and you've got the Russians in Africa down here, and then you've got, the opening scene in Afghanistan, right? It is Afghanistan, and other stuff. And part of the point of the book, I thought, was to show the truly global nature of the threats and the warfare that's going on.
Yeah. It's interesting because the military is kind of uniquely a team, and that includes the Russian military and pretty much all the militaries we put in there. So you do have perspectives that I think are relevant and fun for people to read about. So if you follow kind of the jet jockey who's flying over and taking out tanks and that kind of thing, that's exciting. But on the other hand, in one of our chapters, we've got a tank loader, and I don't know if anyone in here has been in a tank, but being inside the tank as a loader is possibly one of the worst positions. The driver can see out, the gunner can see out, the commander can see out, but the loader has no windows. So he literally is kind of in this windowless world. So we put this whole chapter as basically from the perspective of a tank loader who's on the commander's tank. So there are relevant things happening, as Mark just said, around him, but he only experiences them kind of in this very visceral fashion. He is literally sweaty and stinky and sad and about to fall asleep. He's been in the tank for 12 hours straight, and he's ready to collapse. But he has a job to perform, and he realizes since he's on the commander's tank, it's a pretty important job. So I think in some ways what we did, and Mark challenged us to do this, is that there are bystanders in war who are involved in it that see the protagonists or even the antagonists that are doing something, and it's exciting or intriguing to see from their perspective what it looks like.
So part of your point also, I thought, was to emphasize esprit de corps, if I could say that to a Marine, but to show how
Please do.
These units are, the guys in them have loyalties, to their buddies, and to which I thought you did a really good job with the Russians. That's a very complicated, because you have to have a great villain to make this story work, and he happens to be the Russian.
Right, and you don't want to make them phony with just black hats and twirling their mustaches or whatever. I mean, there's some pretty dastardly things that are happening. I knew from the beginning it was going to be a challenge, or let's just say an important part of the story is to sell the Russian mindset in this attack, why it's important for them, why the president of Russia feels it's in his national interest, but it's also his political fortunes and his personal fortunes are all tied up into reclaiming this mineral mine in Africa, and he's willing to go to these incredible steps to do it because this plan has been written up and sort of sold to him. And it was super important that you see the Russian characters. There's different nuances. There's two major Russian generals, colonel generals is what they're called in Russian, and they have very different personalities. They have slightly different missions, but there's a little bit of a conflict between the two of them, which is a small part of it. And it was just very important that everyone feel as real as you could make them in the amount of words that we have to sell the story.
I mean, Mark challenged us early on and said you can't have two-dimensional enemy. If you do, no one's really going to buy into the protagonist because the opponent doesn't look that scary. And I think in some ways what we try to do is realize that even in the antagonists, they have conflicts. So you don't have this kind of common front where everybody's doing what they've been directed to do. In this case, we have two generals who have very distinct personalities, and they're a bit opposed to one another.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought that part was fascinating, and the things they were willing to do, that various warriors were willing to do for themselves, but also for each other. I mean, real sacrifice, like taking a bullet. That very impressive. Why is it called red metal? You want to tell us about what the mine is? Krasnaya is the Russian for red, but.
Well, so rare earth metals are a very discrete and very scarce form of different types of minerals, and they come in lots of different varieties. We mentioned ytterbium. There's a fair amount of different types of materials that are out there, but they're very good in things like electronics or global positioning systems, missile guidance systems, and they come into use, I think, mainly in electronics, but you can't replicate them with other material. So if you can't find this specific type of material, you literally are at a loss economically. So at least what we present in the book is if there are these scarce materials globally, whoever owns them literally is able to kind of leverage the future against another opponent.
So that is the mine.
That's and it's a double play. Yeah, definitely a play on words. Obviously, red metal is the name of the Russian operation, but alludes to the metals that are in Africa.
And also armor and the other.
Right. No, I get it.
Tanks, guns.
Right. I thought it was. Just lost my train of thought. Sorry, I'm having an attack of being old. Oh, I know what it was. What I thought was interesting is that really it's the Chinese who've been developing Africa. They've done a lot of projects of putting in railroads and all kinds of stuff. I wasn't aware. Are the Russians actually that active in Africa also, or did that just work for your story?
It worked for the story. They don't run this mineral mine. There is Russian activity there. You're correct. The China is. We even literally just sort of to put a little bit of flavor in there. We discuss a Chinese base that's been bypassed and whatnot. China's probably going to be book 2 if we have a book 2. So we didn't want to go that route in book 1. But yeah, Kenya was a good location for this to happen, just for logistic reasons in the story.
So interestingly enough, we were all just in New York at Thriller Fest, and so we are in the Grand Hyatt atop Grand Central Station, and all of a sudden the Secret Service arrives and all these other people, guys are talking to their necks wearing suits and all the rest of it, and the president of Taiwan is arriving in New York under very stressful conditions. The Chinese don't want her to be there, and we okayed it. And so we had to be rooted around the hotel, and they're closing elevators and all this other stuff. And then, where'd Ann go? She was here. Anyway, And oh, there you are. So Ann Wilson, another thriller writer who lives here, and I were having a drink, and we were sitting there in the window looking out across 42nd Street, and this huge demonstration has erupted, and neither one of us was clear whether this was pro-Taiwan welcoming the president, or whether this was people from representing Beijing.
Yeah, I think they were paid.
Not welcome.
Yeah, I think they were paid.
Well, that's
Chinese.
what you said, but you know, the really amazing part was that neither Ann nor I could be sure what the flag was. I mean, I couldn't believe I didn't actually recognize the Chinese flag. So Ann looked it up on her phone so we could decide whether this was the pro or the con. But then you guys pointed out to me that that Beijing actually pays people to show up and do, because I mean, I thought, how would there be this many people in New York City that were, you know, representing Beijing, and yet there they all were, and they had media, and they had bullhorns, and they were waving flags and carrying
There's
on.
a ton of security there, as I guess there needs to be. There's a lot of security.
So then I read your book, and we have the Chinese infiltrating Taiwan because they're apparently never going to let it go. I mean, the Hong Kong, the write-ups about Hong Kong and the protesters had made it clear that China would like Hong Kong and Taiwan to their sort of rogue provinces or rogue
Right.
to be back fully in the fold, right?
Yeah. It makes sense for China to want Taiwan back because of A, of its success, and B, just what's fomented by a former part of the country.
I mean, it's something that's always interested the military is we drew many years ago this very odd boundary called the 9-dash line. And it includes kind of these vast spaces of ocean, the Senkaku Islands, the Parcel Islands, all of this group of islands that no one really wants. There's flocks of seabirds on them, etc. But to China, that's part of their space. And if you're predominantly a land power and you start to gain enough oomph, if you will, you start to look at your neighbors, and really what starts to get interesting is, hey, we need to command this sea. So at least, what we posit in the book is Taiwan has always been, as Mark said, kind of that one little unattainable dangling object that China has not been able to control, and clearly has always said they fall under us. So it's a difficult spot. I think, for us, it worked in the book because America has written into its policies, its defense policies, that we are able to fight on a two-front war. And I think that's kind of the premise that the Russians grab hold of, which is, what about a three-front war? Can you do three? And so that's kind of what we get into in the book.
It's an interesting book to be writing just at this moment, isn't it?
Yeah, I kind of knew as we were working on it, like something will be some sort of conflagration at some point. You never really know. I mean, we started this book in 2016, and obviously Russia's been bellicose for a while, and China we have our issues with. But it was never. We spent a lot of time looking at NATO and how relatively weak NATO is, and we also spent a lot of time talking to each other about strategic surprise, which is sort of the theory that Russia could not invade the West because it would take them 2 years to get ready to do so, and our spies and satellites and whatnot would see that. So if they don't have that strategic surprise, they can't actually do it. So in our story, we have but Russia has a way around that. It's more of an operational raid and less of a very wide. There's the thing that's they've been talking about for 50 years or more. It's called the pizza slice, where if Russia invades via Belarus and Ukraine, they would converge towards Berlin. And so that's kind of been military doctrine. And Rip and I were even in Germany talking to a former tank general, German, and he sort of like referenced that. He's like, well, yeah, but this story wouldn't work because the pizza slice, and we'd see them building up and all this other stuff. And then we said, well, what about if it was an operational raid for this particular objective? And
he was. So we talked to General Klaus Feldman. He's the last one-star German Panzer commander. So now they've reduced their Panzer forces that they don't need a one-star in charge anymore. And he was very vocal about it. It's obviously unclassified, but he said we used to have under his command 2,200 of their tanks, and now it's down to 250. So he actually queried us. We kind of drew out this map and said, what if? And as Mark said, the first thing he gravitated towards was any large frontage is not going to succeed because we're ready for hordes of Russians, if you will. We said, well, our premise in the book is not hordes of Russians; it's a laser focus directly to Stuttgart. And his eyes kind of got wide. And then he started to quiz us, as probably only old generals are able to do. And he said, "Did you see all of the ammunition bunkers on your way from Poland into Germany?" And we said, "Well, we weren't really looking." He said, "They're supposed to be out in the forest." And we said, "Well, we didn't kind of climb around the forest." He said, "Well, that's good because they're not there anymore." And he said, "Did you see all the bridges rigged with explosives to drop the bridges when the Russians come?" I said, "Well, we weren't crawling under the bridges either, General Feldman, but presumably there's a point." He said, there is. Those explosives have been taken off at the behest of the government. And so we really have kind of opened the front door of Europe. And as we showed it, the plan to him, and we've credited him in the book and said thank you to him in German in there, we realized that maybe there was more validity to what we'd written than we actually thought.
It's a scary thought. Maybe we're in a Maginot Line kind of, moment thinking that everything is safe because of and of course, what happened with the Maginot Line. The Germans just went around it. Didn't have any effect. So I thought, unfortunately, we can't talk about it, but there's a very interesting Chinese tactical maneuver that happens in the front of the book too, and I thought that was very clever. So when you read it, you can, I wish that we could talk about some of the really good stuff in the book, but then we'll send everybody home cross. So we can't do that.
We can hit some of the great characters.
Why don't you do that? Actually, one of the things that's interesting was all the people that, because they have a big a cast list at the front, so to help you keep track of everybody, which is good.
I mean, it's a larger story. So I mean, it's a very intelligent story. You've got a lot going on. So when you dive into it, be prepared to kind of get engaged quite heavily from the get-go. But we did develop characters very deeply. I mean, Mark kind of beats the drum regularly and says it's really not about the technology. We're going to put that in there because your average military thriller reader really enjoys knowing the technology is real, its capabilities and limitations are real, and so that obviously is very well researched in the book. But we focus very heavily on these characters, and so as I mentioned when we started out, Mark said, okay, you've got this guy, and I'll take this girl, and you've got that guy, and this girl, and that stuff. So we kind of divided up characters, mainly because we had posited that character as we went through the plot. And so I think what really got exciting was, as we drew up some of our, I don't want to say favorite characters, but the main characters, we ended up with very deep kind of backgrounds to them, and we developed heavily, where do they come from, why are they here, what are their motivations, and so for me that was very exciting. I think for Mark, he does it on every book, but for me it was exciting to kind of see through the eyes of a young lieutenant who is crawling into the cockpit in the middle of war and is thrust kind of into combat, but is very, very junior. I mean, in some ways, one of our characters, her name is Sandra Glisson, her call sign is Glitter, which you can find out why. A very neat story. But she's really in a lot of war books you have kind of a coming of age, someone who's in a baptism of fire. In this case, ours is female and learns kind of through some hard things, but learns to lead the right way and takes charge.
So which batch of characters do you want to start out with?
You've got to hit Pauline. Mark conceived of, I think, what's probably going to be one of our fan favorites, which is a female partisan named Pauline. I'll let Mark go from there.
Yeah,
You're going to handle the women in this discussion.
No, a lot of them are ribs. They're not ribs. Couldn't have sounded more wrong if I tried. No, it was important to me from the beginning that not every character in the book would be some, jet fighter pilot or square-jawed Marine. And if a big war like this came, it would affect every one of us, whether or not we were wearing a uniform or not. So there's a character, a young Polish woman who's 20 years old, and she works at a coffee shop in Warsaw, and to save money for a car, she joined the Territorial Defense Force, which actually happens, and it's their version of weekend warriors, and they carry old rifles primarily and whatnot, and she wants nothing to do with any sort of conflict, and the war comes to her, and she, not because she's a superhero, not because she suddenly becomes G.I. Jane or anything like that, she survives her first encounter and becomes sort of an iconic figure to the Poles about this thing that's going on, which sort of gives her sort of more authority as the story wears on. She's never portrayed as someone that just suddenly became, Rambo or anything like that. She's just there, and she's the eyes of the average person. I'm a civilian, military, and I love these books as much as anybody in the military does. This type of book. So it was important to me that we could see it through different eyes, and not just people who've been spending their life preparing for what's going down.
We had another female character that I think we're both pretty proud of, and her name's Captain Diana Del Vecchio. She's a submarine captain, and we had a chance to go down and visit the actual USS John Warner. And as we were touring the boat, the weapons officer, this really great guy, was kind of showing all of the whole crew was fantastic. They were really very welcoming. And I've been on submarines before, but they kind of opened the door and the hatch, if you will, and let us in. And so I was asking them a bunch of questions. Halfway through the tour, I kind of realized, having read the news, wait a minute, you guys just earned what's called the Battle E for firing missiles into Syria. And I said, oh my gosh, I didn't even remember that. He goes, yep. And I said, well, let's sit down. I want to ask you a question. I said, we've written into this book that me and Mark have put together a female captain for your boat. How is the submarine community going to deal with that? Is that going to be, something that they're not interested in? And I kind of thought of my own community as an infantry and reconnaissance officer, that I think that would be a little tough to have an infantry and reconnaissance officer as a battalion commander. So it hasn't happened yet. It's definitely in the future, but we're not quite there yet. So he looked at me and he said, well, sir, I'll be honest with you. He said, we've got 3 women on our boat right now. And he said, the Navy detailer sent us the top, not the top 1%, but the top 0.5%. These women are so good at what they do that we feel kind of like we're not up to their game on a regular basis. All 3 of them had been promoted on the boat during the last tour, and they were the ones who had been firing these missiles and earned the Battle E for the ship, which is a very big distinction to get on board a submarine. So getting his endorsement was a big deal. I guess the follow-up I was mentioning when we were up at ITWs, I had a chance to meet Senator Warner, the elder statesman.
Are you going to tell the PG version?
I'm going to tell the PG version. Well, I'll try.
Double check. This is our first talk.
Well, he's a neat guy, so he's kind of fun to talk to. He was married to Liz Taylor back in the day, so, just being around the guy is kind of entertaining. But I said, hey, sir, we wrote this book, and he had heard about it, and he said, well, I heard you've got my submarine. And I said, we do. We've got your namesake in there. And I said, I wanted to let you know that the captain of the ship that we portray in the book is female. He says, about goddamn time. All right, good. So we got his endorsement. I think that's probably, as good as it's going to get right there.
All right, so let's move over to, we only see him briefly, but tell us about, is it Chen is his name anyway, the Chinese commander who's leading his team?
So I think part of the book, the intent was to set up that, it's been written in military theory for a long time. So if you turn to any kind of military book, whether it's Proceedings, the naval book, or it's the Joint Warfare book, there's a million different kind of fairly dry doctrine about, can America fight on one front, can we fight on 2 fronts, can we fight on 3? And really what that means is, can we fight 1 nation, 2 nations, and 3 nations simultaneously? And it kind of harkens back to World War II. So really what we wanted to set up was, if China starts something in the Pacific, our enemies are very shrewd, and Russia is going to watch it and say, aha, America is reacting to this, now's our chance. So that was really the setup. So that character and his evolution and what happens over in that region is really to ensure that, first of all, the reader understands what happens when that occurs. I don't want to get boring into military stuff, but there's this group called Transcom, and they are in charge of moving everything across the world. And so if America goes to war, ostensibly in the Pacific, they have to pick people up, put them on jets, put them on planes. They've got to get boats moving. They've got to figure out the fuel expenditure rates. There's guys who, much smarter than me, who obviously sit there with an abacus and figure this all out. So when that happens and you send all these troops out to the Pacific, if something else happens, it's very hard now for Transcom to get the fuel and the jets and everything and send them somewhere else. So that's really where we got into it, which is this setup in China is the first punch, if you will. And the second punch, Russia does something. And again, Russia has read still reads a lot of our military manuals, and they love reading when generals write articles. That's their favorite thing to read, because it's very high thinkers making decisions. So that really was the crux. That's the start. That's the opening blow, if you will.
It's scary to think they might read this book and be inspired.
So I had a thing that happened several years ago. I wrote the last book with Tom Clancy before he passed away.
Right.
It was called Command Authority. And in that book, Russia invaded Ukraine. They did this thing called passportization, where they gave passports to a bunch of, to all ethnic Russians in Ukraine to justify a reason to create an insurgency or to support the rebels. They did paratroopers, and they went to Sevastopol. They did all these specific things. And that book came out in December of 2013, and in February of 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine, and they did all those things that we talked about. So there was a lot of people that were like, I'd do interviews, and they'd be like, "Do you think Putin read your book?" And first I'd be like, "Do you realize what you just accused me of?" But then I would be like, "No, he didn't read our book. We read his playbook because they'd invaded Georgia in 2008. Did all these exact same things. So there's all this saber rattling between Russia and Ukraine when we wrote Command Authority, and we just said, if it happens, it's going to happen next February 2nd. If it happens, this is how it would probably go down, because this is how they did it before, and it was relatively successful for them. So I don't worry about someone hasn't thought of this until me, who writes most of my book at Starbucks with a muffin in my hand, it's like, put this together, and all these, thinkers on the other side haven't come up with it.
Well, but there are thriller writers who've been invited to the Pentagon,
Sure,
to sort of do theory. Vince Flynn used to do that, I remember, and some.
I'm waiting for my invite.
Yeah.
I feel like I hit the nail on the head.
I got you into the Pentagon. So,
Okay.
I'll add. We got to mention the story about our infiltrator. We have a very interesting part of this, which we kind of tried to Google what had happened because we weren't 100% sure, but we were collaborating over this. If anyone's used Google Docs, it's a great collaborative workspace. It's a little intimidating for a new author working with a more senior author, because literally while I'm typing, Mark can read over my shoulder and see typos and too many adverbs, and it's like, oh
I
gosh.
had my own stuff to do.
In my head, I'm like, oh my god, Mark's reading my stuff right now. So we were typing together, we were collaborating. I had taken my family. Hawaii is a great spot for soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. They've got a lot of cheap airfares you can get, and they also have a military hotel over there. So we were in the Haliko Hotel, which is a military hotel, and I'm an insomniac to begin with, so I was up at 300, and Mark was up as well, and so we would collaborate fairly efficiently during the morning. So one day while we were typing, the document is only shared between the two of us, but someone else entered the workspace. And we had to Google it later because we found out Google does this. If someone who has a link to your document comes in and they don't have a Gmail account, it assigns them a name. And so, what was it, like Gazelle 325 shows up. It was something like that. It was an animal name and a number. And Mark's like, who is that? I'm like, I have no idea. But
Did you log in under a second name?
Yeah.
And we could see that there was somebody else there hanging out with us. And
they were there for.
They wouldn't answer us.
They wouldn't answer. You got a little messaging thing in the Google Documents thing, and we texted him, and he didn't respond. He was there for 3, 4, 5 minutes, and then left. But I don't know if we were hacked, but it's hard to believe that someone just wandered into our space, because you can't really do that.
Wow.
Michael Flynn.
Interesting point. So you want to tell us about the Russians? Which one of you? Tell us about the evil Russian. Well, he isn't actually. I mean, I thought that the way you portrayed him when he has to face the withdrawal at the mine, whereas his whole mission is to go forward and make it succeed.
Yeah.
When I say evil, I don't think that's fair, but he is the villain in this piece because he's driven to make red metal work.
Right. So there's two colonel generals. One is sort of the younger, dashing guy, and the other is the older guy who they call him the Lion of Dagestan, and he's sort of Russia's most storied general, and his protege is now equal in rank to him, but 12 years, 14 years younger, something like that. And so Boris Lazar is the older general, and Edward Savanayev is the younger general. And each of them are given a spearhead in Operation Red Metal, Savanayev into Europe and Lazar into Africa. And they operate very, very differently. From the very beginning, when they read the plans together, they have very different impressions of what their job is and the validity of the mission and whatnot. And Lazar is like, a lot of boys are going to come home dead over some rocks in Africa. When Savanayev saw it as his way to be the Russian general that attacked Europe and got back out and did everything. So he saw it as his own personal legacy. It's not quite that ham-fisted, you know. There's a lot of other nuance to it and whatnot, but he's just more brash. And Lazar is just sort of weary and beaten down by it, but he sees this as his sort of last hurrah, and he also sees himself as a Russian patriot who's going to go execute that mission.
But I think it's interesting. Also, it works on a couple levels. That this does happen in the military, where someone is very senior to another officer. So in this case, we've got General Nazar, who was an instructor for General Sabaneyev before when he was a young captain. And once you hit kind of the 2 and 3 star ranks in all militaries, things start to kind of get a little uneven. So you can have somebody who is a 3-star general for 6, 8, 10 years, and one of his subordinates, someone who's at one point his understudy, kind of moves up and now is of equal rank. And so that's really what we portrayed in this. And in a lot of ways, General Lazar is much wiser, though. So the kind of what he brings to it is that he has thought considerably about what does the expenditure of blood and treasure really mean to us. Sabaneyev is very, as Mark says, is kind of gallivanting and ready to make a name for himself. So I think that'll be interesting for readers, is that you have two, in this case, antagonists who are of equal rank, but maybe not of equal experience.
I was actually thinking about the one that wasn't the general.
Oh, Borbakov.
Oh,
Yeah.
the major, yeah.
He's the one.
Let's say there's 3 major Russians, and we picked 2 of them, and
That's
that's
right.
not the one she's talking about. Colonel Borbakov is a Russian Spetsnaz colonel. I guess he's a major at the beginning.
Yeah, and Spetsnaz is special forces in Russia.
Yeah, and so he is in Africa at these metal mines when they are taken out of Russian hands at the beginning of the book. We didn't want to make it just this evil Russian attack. We wanted there to be some sort of justification. Russia does have a legit beef for they lost these mines. Maybe not that legit a beef, but they lost these mines, and they think that was very unjust, and they think this is the West, doing what they can to destroy them, and that plays into their motivation to go get them back. Borbakov is the Spetsnaz colonel at the mines. He has to sort of surrender and leave in shame, and it's very humiliating to him. And he's with a colonel who wants nothing to do with this war and wants to just get out of there. But Borbakov was ready to die for those rocks, And so he spends the next 3 years working on this plan to retake the mines. And when the Russian president, Anatoly Rivkin, finds out what, that this exists, this plan exists, this Operation Red Metal, people tried to keep it from him because they thought it was so ostentatious and dangerous. When he finds out about it, he executes it.
We've got one scene I've got to mention. So if you mentioned Major and then Colonel Borbakov, there's one scene that I think we're both particularly proud of, where what we tried to do was show that Borbakov obviously is enacting, now has permission, I should say, to enact this very evil scheme. And so in one scene we have 2 now young majors. So Borbakov is running the show, if you will, he's the strategic planner. And there are these 2 majors who meet with one another in Belarus, and they're both Spetsnaz majors. So they're kind of where Borbakov was at the beginning of the book. They're in the same rank, and they embrace each other warmly. They clearly know each other. And then through their discussion over some vodka, because they've just met one another, and I won't reveal kind of how they find and see one another, but we reveal Borbakov's plan. So instead of having Borbakov kind of, I don't know, maybe monotonously sit in front of a map and say, you go here and you go here, and draw some arrows on a map and show where the tanks are going to go, we have these 2 majors who are now describing over some vodka what the plan is going to look like and how proud they are to enact this plan and who they've got in their ranks. And they've got one guy who they both know who's a sergeant who they say, oh, that guy, he's a bear of a man, you're lucky to have him in your ranks. And so you kind of get a better feel on not just Borbakov's big red arrows moving on the map, but how is it enacted by the guys who actually have to do it. So I think from my perspective, it was a clever way of showing the plan without just boringly sitting on a map and showing people pointing.
It was more clever than my first draft, which was hundreds of pages of exposition that ended up getting cut, and rightly so. But it's funny. Like when we first turned it in, my editor was like, all right, it's getting a little boggy right here. You know, as I go back through it, I'm like, wow, it just turned into some sort of a manual.
That's because you were telling yourself the story. You
That's
know,
exactly
it takes a
right.
while. I mean, all first drafts are out there telling himself. One of the things I know as an editor is that a big job for an editor with a first draft is to take out all the repetition, because the author picked it up and put it down and picked it up and put it down and had to get back into the story, and so inevitably you wind up repeating stuff,
Right.
you know, to remind yourself, and then, you know, but when you read it all the way through, those things
Right, and then
show up.
the thing that happens is if somebody has a funny nose, every time you mention them, you mention the funny nose because it was 3 weeks ago when you were talking about this character or whatever. And so as you go back and edit it, you're like, all right, that is
once was okay.
a little overbanked,
Right,
yeah.
That would definitely be that. Actually, for all the military dazzle and the technology, this is a truly character-driven book, and I like the fact that all of the characters are a mix of both patriotic, personal. You know, there's nobody's acting out of just one thing. Sometimes, you know, in a revenge thriller, you get a really one-dimensional character because it's just rage driving them, and you know everything else falls away. But that is not the case. Interestingly enough, this afternoon I read Daniel Silva's new book, because I'll be talking to him Saturday, and there's some very interesting parallels and contrasts, because Daniel started out a book, and then the Khashoggi thing happened, and everything about this book that we're going to talk about Saturday suddenly had to change, because you know he was dealing with an Al Saud error, and then when the Khashoggi murder happened, it all changed it. But it's another very complicated thing. What I think is interesting is that both of you are positing the Russian threat. It's like the Cold War has returned.
never left.
Or never left. And it makes me think back. In 2011, my husband and I did a cruise around the Black Sea, which we had wanted to do forever, from its round trip Istanbul. So we're going up, and then we curve around, and we get to Georgia, where they're busily preparing for the Olympics, and it looks like a mud bath. I mean, it's just a disaster. But anyway, we move on to the Crimea. So we arrive in Sebastopol, which I was not a Russian major at Stanford, but I took Russian, and I had a wonderful Russian professor, so I can still remember some of it. So we all got off the cruise ship, and people did things, and I said to Ralph, I don't want to do that. Let's go over to that little boat down there, which is a Russian boat, where they're going to take Russian people out, sail around Sebastopol. And he said, really? And I said, sure, I can do this. You know? So in fact, we do. So they're all kind of looking at us, and we sailed right through the Russian Navy. We sailed all around Sebastopol. It was a whole tourist thing. They were showing us stuff. I could only remember one word in 20, but, you know, and I thought, boy, isn't this weird? You know, and then, you know, we were taking photographs, and I kept waiting for them to come and, like, take the camera, throw it. And then 3 or 4 years later, that would now be impossible, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you could not do it, but there was that little window there, you know, where we were actually 2 Americans, visibly Americans,
Right.
sailing around the Russian Navy, you know, and it's huge. It was, until global warming, their only warm water port. So there's always been this huge tension. I wrote a master's thesis on this, a huge tension where the Russians kept trying to get Turkey's permission to sail in and out of the Black through the Dardanelles and so forth, and it led to centuries of
That's why
conflict.
Syria is so important to Russia now. That's
Right.
They call it their sort of permanent aircraft carrier of the Mediterranean.
Yeah, but now they've got Murmansk. I mean, Murmansk,
Yeah.
I've been to Murmansk now, and you know, it was like 99 in Murmansk. And in World War II, it was frozen in a major port, but today you can actually use Murmansk as a warm water port, so, you know, part of the year. So everything's changing, and I think Russia's changing with global warming, things that they couldn't do. Their Navy couldn't do, for example, they can now do because they have much more access to, you know. In fact, now shipping is moving across the top of Russia. You know, for a long time, the Northwest Passage was the big deal, but now there's a lot of global shipping that is in fact going north and going around Norway and then going around the top of Russia down to China, which is much faster than going the southern routes.
Yeah.
So everything's
Better seas
changing.
also.
Yeah,
Calmer seas.
right.
You know, it's funny because we study this heavily in the military. Our tendency, in what we call the in-between years, between wars that is, we have a tendency to believe that this is peace, and finally we've made it. And, you know, my gosh, everybody's pretty
It's
much...
all bubbling up
and
again.
well, and we tend to believe in our own piece, I mean, the Pax Romana, you can go back to the days of the Romans, and you know.
Or the British.
Or the
the
British.
19th
And
century.
everybody believes, well, look, there's peace and stability in our time, everything's okay. But the tyranny of history really is that that's not the case. And it's one of the reasons we have a standing Army and Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps, is that regardless of what you perceive Russia or China or Iran or North Korea to be, they don't have our best interests at heart.
No.
And so if you really kind of get lulled into believing, well, gosh, finally peace is broken out, you just need to look back to history to know that no, that's not the case. Eventually something doesn't happen the way it should.
And the top dog country keeps evolving.
That's right.
It really is. If you go back and look, the 16th century belonged to Spain, and then it was the Dutch, and then it was the British, and then it became us after World War II. And anybody who thinks that won't continue, it'll be somebody else that's delusional.
And you've struck on one of what I think is one of our premises in the book is that America has been fighting, and its NATO allies have been fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so if you're looking for a counterinsurgency force in the world, you're really not going to find a better one than the United States right now, because the Army and the Marine Corps and the Navy have retooled themselves to fight on land and to fight this counterinsurgency. So that was part of the premise of the book, is what happens when the next war inevitably, as all of them have, doesn't look anything like the last war that we fought. We in the military, we're particularly susceptible to that.
Right.
That we believe, well, we're just going to continue to fight the same war, and so let's just keep preparing for that one. And inevitably, if you just learn from history, that never happens. The last war is nothing near what the next one is. So that was kind of our premise. Mark obviously has a degree in poli-sci, and so we had some discussions where I kind of brought in the military angle and he the political aspect of it, and we said, what will it look like? And we said, well, they're reading all of our books and they read all our magazines. It will be a three-front war, and Russia, China, you can name the adversary, is not going to fight in counterinsurgency, and they're going to do things much more wisely.
Well, on that cheerful note,
There we go.
any of you have questions that you would like to ask him? I'm really sorry that we can't talk more about the book, as I've said, it will spoil it. So I hope we've at least prepared you for the vast scope
You guys
and
have
all the characters. Anyone have a question?
I read a lot of books about Russia, and when I'm reading the thrillers, there's a lot of them out there right now that involve Russia. It seems like the authors will sometimes choose to use Putin by name, others will choose Anatoly Rivkin, right? I'm wondering what goes into that decision. It seems like Putin's straight out of central casting already.
Yeah.
So why would you or would you not? In your case, you didn't choose him.
That's a good question, and it's a question that I don't really have a good answer for, but I can tell you that a couple of years ago I did a Gray Man book called Agent in Place, and the Syrian president is Bashar Assad, and the publisher wanted me to change the name, and I was like, you really think he's going to sue us? So he's got bigger fish to fry right now. He's fighting a multi-front civil war. But they wanted to do that. I normally steer clear. I've done the North Korean leader, and I changed his name, and everything else about him is exactly the same. Rivkin is, no different from Putin. He's been in power a long time. He's sort of beholden to the oligarchs and is an oligarch himself, and all these sorts of things. It's a good question, and I never asked, did legal say that, or was this just something we're just trying to
There's
head off
actually
the
a
path?
more practical answer if you'd really like to hear it.
Because
The more practical answer is that it can date your book.
yeah,
If you use a real person, just like you have to be very careful about not using specific amounts of money, because it can dramatically change. I remember somebody wrote a golf mystery years ago, and he said to me, I made the purse like $10,000. I mean, that was a really old golf mystery. So there are things, but if you do use real people, the book loses that kind of. So I think it was much more about that than it was worrying about
Probably
legal.
so. I was the ghostwriter on a book where I, at the very end, you meet this terrorist who's like a mastermind. And when I first wrote it, it was Bin Laden.
Right.
And then Bin Laden got killed after the draft went in, and so I changed it to Anwar al-Awlaki, and he got killed right before my date. And I was just like, I'm going to stop playing this game.
Yeah, you can. Everybody knows that you really mean Putin, but if you don't make him, something happens between, that'll work out. I'm going to, at this moment, say goodbye to our Facebook audience and thank you for joining us.